Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whatever time you see this video. We have a special topic and we have a special guest today, on the agriculture and farmers in India. So we have a very special guest and distinguished guest and a renowned food and trade policy analyst, and is a well-known journalist and a writer, thinker, and a researcher, and is also an award winner of Krishi Yoda in 2019, and is a member of Team Anna Hazare against the anti-corruption for the anti-corruption movement in the anti-corruption movement, and he is member of many organizations and civil societies, which are working for the improving the lives of the farmers in India and also getting some good things to the agriculture in India. So welcome to the show, Mr. Devinder Sharma ji. How are you? Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So very nice to have you. And we would like to know, every time we see in Indian politics or Indian economy, the farmer and agriculture is one of the important topic in India. And we also have, so we want to know a little bit, even globally also, even US elections also is kind of talking about the farmers. Whenever we talk about them in the Midwest, core part of the US or even core part of India is the driving engine is in the agriculture. And in this scenario, we want to know a little bit more background of the Indian agriculture since we got independence. So I would really appreciate if you can tell us a little. We know a little bit, but not much detail the way you've been researching and working on this particular topic, please.
Okay, when India got independence in 1947, it was in the backdrop of the Bengal famine. And we all know that Bengal famine happened in 1943, in which some people estimate 3 million, some people say 6 million people perished. And that was the backdrop in which India got its independence. And soon after we became independent, there was a crisis in agriculture. Food was a scarce commodity. And in fact, this scarcity loomed on for long. And India could meet its food obligations from under a program called PL 480. And the wheat would come from North America, straight into the hungry mouths of India. And that is why at one stage, India earned the title or epithet called country living in ship-to-mouth existence. And it is not that our policymakers didn't try to boost up our food production. I remember reading that Jawaharlal Nehru, the then Prime Minister, in 1955 from the ramparts of the Red Fort on August 15, which is our Independence Day, he had said that it is very humiliating for any country to import food. So everything else can wait, but not agriculture. And Nehru did try his best. He introduced a number of community development programs to increase agriculture production and so on, but it didn't work the way it should have. And then we had Lal Bahadur Shastri as the Prime Minister for a short while. And that was the time when India went to war with Pakistan. And not many people know that 1965 was a drought year, and we had serious problems on our food front. Hunger was reigning supreme. And that was the time when Lal Bahadur Shastri, if you remember, gave a call saying that you must fast for one day in a week. Monday he preferred. And the idea was that whatever food we have, we share and care, or we share among ourselves, by keeping fast those who can afford. That was his objective, which was very well taken. And I think the country followed it up. Many people still do fast on Mondays. And that was a time when India, if you recall, an incident happened. Not many people know, but it was when an American journalist was interviewing Lal Bahadur Shastri. A question that he asked was that, what do you think about the war in Vietnam? Because at that particular time, a war was also ongoing in Vietnam. And Shastri replied, it is an act of aggression. And that small sentence annoyed the then American President Lyndon Johnson. And how can a hungry nation teach a lesson or point a finger at the richest power on the planet? And so therefore, they went into what is called a stop-go policy, which means stop the food exports till the time India stands with a begging bowl or gets onto its knees. And that is what happened. And I recall when C. Subramaniam was the food minister at that particular time, and in one of my conversations with him, he is no more now, but I remember in one of my conversations with him, I had asked him, I said, you were the food minister at a time when the Americans had stopped food exports to India. And that was the time when Lal Bahadur Shastri was the prime minister. So I said, how did you tide over that particular period when India was living in what is called a ship-to-mouth existence? He said, he said, I still recall, he said, you are very right. There was a time when I had only food stocks left for 7 days. And I called a meeting of all my officials and asked them to identify the ship carrying food and sailing closest to India. The ship was identified, and then we sent an SOS to the American president saying, please divert this ship to India. Otherwise, millions of people will die of hunger. And that was the reason why India got its epithet called ship-to-mouth existence, a country living in ship-to-mouth existence. Now, imagine at that particular time and this kind of a crisis, I wonder how the political leadership must have, tried to fight it out or try to address this particular issue. And that is how, after Shastri passed away and then Mrs. Indira Gandhi took over, that was the time when Norman Borlaug, the American scientist who is credited for bringing in the Green Revolution, he had developed those Mexican wheat varieties, dwarf wheat varieties in Mexico in the institute called CIMMYT. And that is where the interest was, India's interest, and of course there was a debate in India that we should import those varieties and cultivate in India. And there was a ongoing debate. Eventually, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, when she became the Prime Minister, she took this decision of allowing seed wheat import to come into India. And I remember, if I'm not mistaken, 18,000 tons of seed of dwarf wheats was imported from Mexico and distributed in small packets in the areas which are already demarcated by the policymakers. And that was the beginning of what is called as a Green Revolution. And this was in 1966 when Mrs. Gandhi became the Prime Minister. And the next year, 1967, India recorded 5 million tons more wheat production, which was a record bumper production India had ever achieved at that particular time. And that is why it got the name of Wheat Revolution. And Wheat Revolution, then to Rice Revolution, and eventually one of the American scientists had given the name Green Revolution. So Green Revolution was born, and India became a harbinger of Green Revolution. We of course became self-sufficient, quote unquote, in food production over a couple of years. But hunger, as you know, still persists. And I think that was a situation when we moved from being a food importer and eventually we became a net food exporter. Although we still have around 200 million people who go to bed hungry. Now that's because of excess in distribution. But as far as production is concerned, I think India is very comfortable. We are, even in the COVID era, we are not at all dependent on external food aid. And India has so much of food stocks that I think in the next 2 years, it doesn't have to worry. So I think it has been a long, I would say saga of growth in agriculture, which has stood the test of time. And I think it is what I call as it will be, whenever history is written, this would be a glorious period that would be mentioned.
It's very nice. I mean, we understood. We had a famine, and we had. Dependent on the external parties to feed us. That's when government policies and then the hard work and the discipline of the farmers actually helped the whole country. To be self-sufficient in the food, and especially feeding our Indians. So just we want to understand a little bit. Whenever we come to talk about farmer, we all know. We respect them, no doubt about it, and we also know that they are very hardworking and very disciplined. Because if you have a small plant in the house, if you don't water it properly, on a regular basis. And if you don't take care of it, on a regular time, it will die. Within few days or few weeks. So when we look at a small plant at home, when we talk about feeding whole country. So how much discipline they should be, and how hard they should be working in the fields. So we all respect the work and the dedication they have to work the job and feeding the country. We pranam them. So we want to know. So what is that? They make on an average. Are they comfortable? Now they made India comfortable by producing more agricultural produce and also exporting and making India proud in some of the sectors. So what is that? You've been studying them. So what is an average farmer in India makes?
Well, I think one thing we must understand is that while over the years and over the decades, agriculture production has gone up steadily. Today, I think we are expecting close to about 298 million tons of food grains. And we already produce more than 300 million tons of fruits and vegetables. We are the number one producer of milk in the world, and so on. I think Indian farmers have, as far as production is concerned, demonstrated that it is possible for even a small farmer to join hands and build up the country's economy to a position that we are no longer a hungry nation, and we are a strong I would say nation. When I say strong, because if agriculturally you are strong, then I think you are more economic sovereign. Sovereignty in economics or in economic terms comes around only if you are very strong in agriculture. If you are a food importing country, I think you will always be vulnerable to external threats, and that's what Jawaharlal Nehru. He was very right when he said for any food importing country, it is very humiliating for any food importing country. And he was very right. There is arm twisting going on. There are pressures that the countries have to bear. And Indian farmers actually have pulled us out of that kind of a crisis, which could have happened, given the scenario in India. So having said that, one would have expected that as the production rises, the farm incomes will also go up. But on the contrary, it has been just the opposite. I still recall there was a study done by UNTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. It was an international study where they said it was sometimes in the mid 2000, and the study said that in the past 20 years, I'm not exactly remembering which year to which year, but for the 20 years, it said the output prices globally had remained static, which means if you adjust for inflation, the price farmers were getting at the end of the 20 years was equal to what he was getting 20 years, before, and that tells you that the prices had remained static. When the farm gate prices or the output prices remain static, it means the incomes had remained frozen. And then, a recent study has shown, it is a study from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, along with the New Delhi-based think tank called ICRIER. The study has shown that between 2000 and 2016-17, 16-17 years period, the farm incomes in India, farmers lost 45 lakh crore rupees, which means a huge loss or setback to agriculture. And this also tells us very clearly that on an average, yearly loss was about 2.64 lakh crore. And this was an extraordinary crisis, I'm sure you will agree. The 45 lakh crore loss is a monumental loss that the farmers have suffered. But I never heard any policymaker saying this was an extraordinary crisis and India needs to provide an economic stimulus or a bailout package or whatever the world provides when something happens to corporates. Even a small little dent and everyone starts shouting that the corporate sector needs support. But it didn't happen for agriculture. And then subsequently, if you look at Niti Aayog's report, Niti Aayog had said that between 2011-12 and 2015-16, these 5 years, the average income of the farming family, and I'm talking about the growth in the average income or real income, was less than 0.5% every year, 0.44% to be exact. Now, this was in the 5-year period. Subsequently, Niti Aayog itself went on record saying that the income for the next 2 years was near zero. In any case, less than 0.5% is also zero, near zero. So imagine from 2000 onwards till today, if the farm incomes have remained static or have declined, I still don't understand and wonder how do the farmers survive. Why I'm saying this is because Economic Survey 2016 is a document that the government produces every year and released 2 days before the budget is announced. And Economic Survey 2016 said that the average income of a farming family in 17 states of India, which means roughly half the country, is 20,000 rupees a year. Now, 20,000 rupees a year means less than 1,700 rupees a family is surviving on. I shudder to think, how do these families survive in 1,700 rupees? Because after all, you can't rear a cow in 1,700 rupees. You can't even rear a dog, a pet dog, in 1,700 rupees. How can a family, or how do a family survive in less than 1,700 rupees a month? So that tells you very clearly, while the farm production went up in India, farm incomes have been on a steep decline, on a terrible, terrible kind of a decline, I would say. And that's the reason why India faces a serious agricultural distress, agrarian distress that India has seen. Now, this is something that the policymakers have to wake up to. And of course, every successive government had made a lot of promises and so on, and have also made a lot of contribution. I'm not denying that. But somehow it was not reflected in bringing down that spate of suicides that India has seen. You know, from 1995 onwards, the what we call a serial death dance on the farm, about more than 330,000 farmers have committed suicide in these so many years. And every year, about 10,000 to 12,000 people, both farmers and farm workers, are committing suicide. I think there is something terribly, terribly going wrong with, as you rightly said, the farm incomes and farm economy. And so therefore, this the biggest challenge the country faces is how to address the agrarian crisis. And I think that is somewhere we nationally and internationally, I think the focus of the policies have to be on how to ensure that agriculture emerges out of the clutches of the crisis that has been existing for so long.
So it's very nicely, mentioned about what kind of spate, our farmers are going through, especially the income-wise. Very sorry to hear that, and hopefully things will improve over a period of time. As you mentioned, there should be a policy, or policy makers should look at this particular issue. So, what do you think? Is it? There are some. We are exporting grains, and we are exporting agricultural produce. We are a state. So why are we that money? Why is it not that money going to the farmers? What kind of policies are stopping or not benefiting the farmers? Is it because of the politics and vote bank politics? Is it what exactly is coming in the way of farmer making more money?
Well, let's be very clear. It is not that agriculture is unproductive or inefficient and the farmers are backward. It is not because of that there is no farm income that we should be proudly talking about. The fact is, it is the economic design. The economic design which America follows, economic design which Europe follows, economic design which World Bank and IMF wants India to follow or have been pushing India to follow, is primarily the reason why farmers in India are dying, or farmers in America are also under severe distress. The economic design is so that, the understanding is that unless you move people out of agriculture into the urban areas, you cannot be achieving higher economic growth. Now, this is a flawed economic design. It has gone on all these years, and the result is for the world to see now. And why I'm saying this is because this economic design, and let me illustrate by an incident which I was present, and I still recall that the year was 1996, way back. 1996, I happened to attend a conference at the M.S. Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai. And I remember the then Vice President of Sustainable Development of the World Bank, a friend of mine, a gentleman called Dr. Ismail Saragalden, and in his presentation said that the World Bank estimates in the next 20 years, that in the next 20 years, which means by the year 2015, the number of people migrating from the rural to the urban areas in India will be equal to twice the combined population of UK, France, and Germany. Now, the combined population of UK, France, and Germany at that time was 200 million. Even now, it is close to that. Now, the World Bank had estimated 400 million people will move out of rural to the urban areas in India by the year 2015. And because this is economic thinking, for a number of years, I thought, I thought we were being warned or being alerted by the World Bank to take corrective steps that this doesn't happen. But then I realized, no, it was not a warning. It was actually a directive to us that we must move people out of rural areas into the urban areas because urban areas need cheaper labor. Now, if this is the way to create labor, and this is the way you push people out of agriculture into the urban areas, in the garb of saying this is what is employment generation, I think the entire economic policies need a rethinking, a revisit. Because after all, coronavirus has shown us very clearly, and these 400 million people, I used to call them as agriculture refugees. The people won't understand when I would say these are the agriculture refugees because they couldn't visualize what I meant. Now, when we have seen millions of people migrating back after the lockdown from the cities to their villages, walking for hundreds of kilometers for days together, without water, carrying adequate supply of food and water. And that actually opened up our eyes. Now we know what I meant was agriculture refugees. The point I'm trying to make is, if the farmer is poor today, it is because of the economic policy. We have deliberately kept agriculture starved or deliberately kept agriculture impoverished to keep the economic reforms viable. Because globally the thinking is that food has to be kept cheap. No wonder American food is so cheap. If you've seen over the decades, the prices haven't gone up because the America subsidizes or has brought about a system where the subsidies actually pull down the prices and for the farmers, and which of course is the reason why food is cheaper in America. The same thing is happening in India. Now, when you don't pay to the farmers, what miracle can you expect? The incomes will not rise in the same way with the income of the other sections have risen. And I have done a number of studies which show that the farm income in India in 45 years between 1970 and 2015 increased by only 19 times. Whereas if I look into the income parity norms, the basic pay of salary of the government employees had increased by 120 to 150 times. The basic pay of university professors and college professors had increased by 150 to 170 times. The basic pay and DA of the school teachers had increased by 280 to 320 times. And the income of farmers by way of the minimum support price for wheat had gone up by only 19 times in 45-year period. Now that tells you exactly and so clearly that if the income of the other section of society had also risen in the same ratio as the proportion as the farmers, many would have committed suicide or quit their jobs. So the point I'm trying to make is agriculture has been deliberately kept impoverished. In fact, when the farmers undertake cultivation, they don't realize they're actually cultivating losses. And that is how the scheme has been built. That is how the economic policies has been designed. So keep agriculture impoverished. People move out of agriculture into the urban areas because cheaper labor is required in the cities. So basically, agriculture is kept impoverished to keep economic reforms viable. And this has happened globally. It is happening in India. And if this is the model, anything that you want to do, whether you bring in agriculture exports or whether you bring in new technology, precision farming or whatever, believe me, farm incomes will not go up. Farm incomes will not go up because basically we don't want incomes to go up. And that is the reason why in America, the US Department of Agriculture, the chief economist of US Department of Agriculture has gone on record saying that since 1960s, American incomes, farmers' income has been on a steep decline. Look at the situation today in America. Look at the spate of suicides in America. Look at the Europe. The farm sector is actually sustained by agricultural subsidies. And we know the OECD, every year provides, of course, a whole lot of subsidies to agriculture. In 2018, the latest figure is $246 billion is what was pumped into agriculture. So if it is subsidies which are sustaining agriculture in Europe and America, in my country, we are not so blessed and not so lucky that we have huge subsidies to give to our farmers. That is the reason why farmers are living in distress, in a serious or severe distress that we can't even imagine, as I said earlier. If you can't bring in the same income, if you can't rear a cow or a dog, and if the farmers are surviving in that income, I think it requires the entire economic focus to go to agriculture. And agriculture can and could have been the powerhouse of economic growth if our economists, the mainland economists all over the world, had not tampered with the kind of policy structure they have laid out, which is actually killing agriculture.
Gotcha. So, you're saying that, the economic policies, of getting the cheap labor to the industrial sector is the one which is driving, the prices down, in the agricultural produce. So, but at the same time, if you look at the subsidies in US and Europe, which I totally got your point, where you're saying that, the subsidies in US, especially the wheat and corn, the producers, if they produce more, they will ask them to stop producing it and the government will pay them. If they produce, again, the produce is less, or if they have the government is willing to release it from their own store, and whatever they have been storing it. And another thing is they do pay to twice. One time when they do pay is like when they will ask them to stop producing it so that a farmer can survive. Another time is when they produce more and the prices have gone down, the US government is paying them some subsidy. I think that particular policy has been, I think either they're still continuing or they're stopping it. I'm not sure, but subsidies are there for sure. But in India, at the same time, there is a theory in the US, so the subsidies are not good for the business. So what is your say on that one?
So it's very interesting. When we talk of agricultural subsidies, nobody is happy, whether in the US or whether in India. You give the subsidies to corporate, everyone is happy. And look at it now, the kind of stimulus America has given ever since President Trump came. Look at this is when you give the stimulus, it is basically a subsidy. And where it has gone to the pocket of the top 1%. We all know that majority of or bulk of the support that has been given, the federal support, goes to the top 1%. In fact, there are numerous studies, there are numerous articles on this very point. Now, the point I think which is very exciting is you said that agricultural subsidies are, of course, not desirable. Nobody is in favor of subsidies. But it's very interesting. I'm sure you will agree. Let's come to the Indian example and also compare it with America. In America, as I said earlier, huge stimulus given to Wall Street, every year or every 2-3 years, whenever they give a package, and there is nobody questioning that. But when you give subsidies to the poor, everyone is up in arms. It is very difficult. The lobbies have managed to give subsidies, but otherwise it was very difficult even in America to give their subsidies. A report by UNTAD India tells us in 2007, if you withdraw the green box support, which rich countries provide, as you know, under the WTO parlance, because these are the subsidies which are not distorted. So if you withdraw those green box subsidies, UNTAD India report showed that agricultural exports from America, Canada, and from Europe would fall by 40%. The point I'm trying to make is even your exports are subsidized, heavily subsidized by the state. And we may see that it's efficient agriculture of Europe and America. No, it is basically the subsidies, the federal support, the amount that Treasury pumps in to keep exports sustaining. And America, we all know, has been dumping number of agriculture commodities into the international market at below prices, and Europe also does it by dumping commodities onto developing countries, which kills our agriculture. And of course, it may be sustaining their economy. But interestingly, I find one very clever way of tarnishing everything or every support that goes to agriculture, whereas welcoming the support which goes to corporates. When you give subsidy to the agriculture sector, to the poor, it is a word which is demonized. We all believe that subsidies are waste of resources. It goes down the drain. Nobody gets help, and it's a waste of, as I said, important resources that the country has, or restricted resources that the country has. But when we give subsidies to the corporates, it's not called subsidies. It's called incentive for growth. And if you look at the amount of subsidies the corporates get, the phenomenal subsidies that go to corporates, both hidden, explicit and implicit subsidies. Nobody questions, because we are very comfortable, because these are so-called incentive for growth. When I ever appear on television and I would say that the subsidies to the corporates are basically the incentive for growth, which is called as incentive for growth to the corporates, is subsidy. The panelists would say, oh, you are anti-development, you don't even understand economics. But I'm so happy that the Prime Minister of India recently had made a statement about a few years back at a time of the ET summit. And he had said that actually the incentive for growth that goes to the industry are actually subsidies. Since then, at least I am not being questioned or not being blamed or not being called an anti-development or a person who doesn't understand economics. But look at the way economists had covered up the subsidies that will go to the corporates. So I'm completely for removing subsidies, but I think that should be across board. It should not be only happening for the poor. It should happen first for the corporates. The world must demonstrate that it doesn't like subsidies. It doesn't like subsidies, first of all, for corporates. Remove the corporate subsidies, and then let's have a playing field, level playing field. That's what the world needs. And I think then only agriculture will emerge out of the crisis it is. Because as long as we go on heavily subsidizing one section, we don't have resources left for putting or making investments in agriculture. I can illustrate give another example. Between 2011-12 and 2016-17 in India, the Reserve Bank of India tells us that the public sector investment in agriculture in India was only 0.4% of the GDP. Imagine a country where 50% population, or roughly 600 million people, are involved in agriculture, directly or indirectly. The support for agriculture was only 0.4% of GDP. Now, what miracle can you expect when you are not investing? That's the question. What miracle can you expect when you don't provide farmers with income, what they require? And so, therefore, we have deliberately kept, as I said earlier, agriculture impoverished. And I think that is a stage from where we have to emerge now. And I think shows like yours will actually carry this message forward, and people all over the world needs to understand that actually agriculture is a victim of economic policies.
Got I got the point of why the agricultural because I've been studying it, and also a little bit, not to the extent of what you have done. So, but when you look at it from the WTO point of view, they restrict the company, exports, which has been subsidized in their own country. Let us say, if you want to sell, a product which has been subsidized in your country, and you want to dump it on the other countries, they do restrict. So is that another subsidy policy of subsidies will be any obstacle in exports?
Well, when you mentioned the WTO, I think it is important to understand. When WTO was to come into existence, there was a Eurego round of negotiations going on at that time under the GATT. And I remember when I was researching for my first book on WTO, Ronald Reagan, when he was the president, he had made a statement which reads something like this, that how long can the American economy survive when we are artificially providing huge subsidies to agriculture? And I think that was the issue which he put on table. And to solve or to address the problem of American agriculture and the European agriculture, the world economists got together, the negotiators got together, and they came up with WTO, basically to find an export market for their surplus, which there were mountains of surplus of beef, butter, and milk in Europe and America, and so on with other commodities also. And so because international law prohibits the countries to dump it into the sea or burn it, so they had a huge stock lying because of overproduction, because of huge subsidies being pumped in agriculture, and so they needed to find a market. So the world got together, and every time you have to solve the problem of which country, you always say the poor in the developing countries would gain, and that is what was said when the WTO came into existence. That the rich countries would be the loser because of your cheaper labor and so on. The cost of production being in the benefit of the poor countries, so they will be able to export more, and so the farmers in developing countries will gain. All these kinds of promises were made. Now we are what? We are 1995. The WTO came into existence, and today we are in 2020. Please tell me, where is that gain that the WTO had promised? The gain has gone only to the rich countries again. In fact, I did a study on the first 10 years of WTO. That was till the year 2005, 1995 to 2005. And I had clearly established that, majority of the countries, developing countries, had become food importing countries, whereas the gainers were basically on either side of the Atlantic, European Union, and of course, America and Canada. And of course, there were some other countries which were called KN groups, which were the largest exporters. So these are the countries which gained at the cost of the poor countries. And this is how, because cheaper food, cheaper commodities by way of highly subsidized food were easily dumped into developing countries. And importing food is importing unemployment. So when poor countries like India imported food, or many other countries, developing countries imported food, they actually imported unemployment, because it first hits the small farmers who are pushed out of agriculture, because when the food comes in so cheap. And that is what has happened. And that is why every WTO ministerial that you see starts, or is the bone of contention there are the subsidies of the rich and the developed countries. And so far, we have failed to resolve that particular issue, even despite the presidents or the head of state of 4 Western African countries who brought up that cotton challenge, if you remember, at the time of the Cancun ministerial, and they had challenged the US subsidies. They wrote a letter, a joint letter also in the New York Times. It became a big issue, but America very cleverly, wriggled out of it, and the problem still remains. America still is dumping cotton onto the global markets because of the subsidies they provide. Because of that is how they get opportunity to result into what is called dumping prices.
Gotcha. I mean, the subsidies in America is, I mean, mostly even in initial time periods of when they were about introduced, there's an opposition from the policymakers. But I mean, due to the vote bank politics, also they have to continue, and they've been doing it even today. I see that some of the subsidies are purely vote bank politics or policies. But at the same time, there are a few things which are beneficial. But what I've been hearing is most of the subsidies are going to the larger farmhouses in the US. They're not, the small farmers are not getting it. That's another issue in the US side. So, I mean, we'd like to keep it that way. I mean, we'll move on to the other topics. I mean, if you're okay, if you want to say anything on that one, I mean, in the US, I mean, what we've been hearing and what my study says, most of the subsidies are going toward the larger farmhouses rather than the small farmers. So the way, unfortunately, these are all manipulated. I mean, we see somehow the intentions may be good. Somewhere the things are getting manipulated, and actual benefit, the intended beneficiary is not getting the benefits. Then the benefits are going to somebody else. So we don't know how it will turn out. I mean, in India, if we implement those things, but I will leave it that way there. And we'll go to another point. I mean, so you mentioned that, I mean, the investment in India is 0.4% from the banks. I mean, and government is not giving them the enough support to the farmers. I feel, I mean, as a individual, even farming, a small farming is an independent business. I mean, it is a small business. I mean, you should know if you want to start a business. Let us say if I want to start a restaurant, just for the sake of for an example, easy example analogy, I should know, I mean, okay, what kind of food will go well, and how much I need to get it, and how many customers am I going to get, how much money am I going to make. So is it, I mean, how much rent I need to pay, and what are my utilities, and all those things. I mean, based on that, I mean, whether it's viable or not, whether this location is viable or another location is viable, or what. So is it carry out better, or is the dining is better? I mean, I need to analyze all those things and make a decision whether to start a business or not. The same way, the farmers also should be aware of, I mean, what product or what produce, I mean, what kind of variety they should, I mean, produce, and when they should produce, how much they should produce, or do they need to diversify, and so do they need to have this knowledge? I mean, I know it will be a little challenging for everybody to be, I mean, aware of or get this knowledge and information and act accordingly. So in that scenario, it will be challenging for a bank to invest. Is that right? Because they invest only when they see a return, and an educated, I mean, businessman. So in this scenario, won't it be challenging for getting a finances for these farmers?
I think, first of all, let's be very clear that the way that you have described is not the way it works.
Okay.
And we need to understand. Agriculture has been a way of life. It is a situation in India where it is not a small business that you talked about. Even in Europe and America, the smallest farmers are not a small business entity. That is the mistake that we commit. What we are being told is not true. That, like every other business entity, you expect farmers to also plan in a business format, and to see that agriculture becomes economically viable. As I told you earlier, I will repeat it again, that if we have deliberately kept the prices low, no farm can become viable unless it is aided or supported by the government in a big way. Let me make it very clear. If the corporates know that what their business is good, please tell me, why are the top corporates of the world in terrible, terrible crisis, not only at the time of the lockdown, but otherwise also. They require a bailout. Why did 2008, 2009 meltdown happen? Please tell me, why did the global meltdown happen? If the companies knew they had that kind of a shrewdness to go in for a business plan, which was workable, it didn't. In fact, if the all business plans are workable, the banks should not be saddled with a huge amount of non-performing assets, whether in India, whether in America, whether in Europe, and across the world. I think we need to understand that that's not the way the economics works. That's not the way business works. Why I'm saying this is very clear that if you look at India, as I gave, this understanding that he doesn't know which variety to go, he knows everything. He does a remarkable job. And I'll give you one example. A state like Punjab. Punjab is in the northwest of India. It is the food bowl of India. We know Green Revolution began in Punjab. Now look at Punjab. Punjab is a state which has a 98% assured irrigation, which means every crop field in Punjab gets it's a regular supply of water, irrigation water throughout the year. In America, if you were to see what is your assured irrigation, it is far, far less than Punjab. Now, let me give you the productivity of wheat, rice, and maize, the three cereal crops, which are the predominant crops being grown and cultivated in Punjab, is a study has shown is the highest in the world. Now, with the highest yield in the world, with the 98% assured irrigation, I'm sure you will agree that Punjab farmers should be very profitable, should be economically viable. But you will be surprised to know that between 2000 and 2015, in these 15 years, a joint study done by 3 universities in Punjab, house-to-house survey done by these 3 universities, showed that the rate of suicide, the number of suicide was 16,600 farmers committing suicide. A state which has the highest productivity in the world for cereal crops has become a hotbed of farmer suicide. That means there is something going wrong. The problem is not in the crop field. The problem is not in the farmer's thinking or his understanding or his wisdom. He has all the capabilities. But as I said earlier, let me go back again. We have deliberately kept agriculture impoverished. If we deny farmers the rightful income, please tell me, how will he be able to sell and make profit the way you want him to do it? It only happens in agriculture that the prices are not in the control of farmers. Why doesn't it happen in the case of industry? Why should a car maker always come out with whatever he price that he thinks is the right price? Have the people ever questioned that? Have the governments ever questioned that? Have the banks ever questioned that price is highly inflated? Does anybody question? No. We all buy at that car the price that the car manufacturer wants us to buy. Similarly for other things. Why can't that happen to agriculture? Do it for agriculture and you will see all other business activities would collapse in front of agriculture. The point I'm making again and again is that because we have kept agriculture deliberately impoverished or starved of resources, that is why agriculture is in a crisis, not because farmers don't have adequate wisdom or they don't have business sense. They have tremendous business sense. They are in fact the best economists. They are in fact the best scientists. But because they are being denied their rightful price, and as I mentioned earlier, if the farm incomes, the ratio that they had gone up in proportion to the other section of society, if the income of the other section of society had also gone up in the same manner, they would have largely committed suicide or would have quit their job. So please, let's be very clear that agriculture is being deliberately kept in a position that it is in today. Otherwise, there was no reason agriculture should have been the powerhouse of the global economy. If we even today, if we really now a lesson that we should draw from COVID and the lesson from coronavirus is that the mistake that we did by keeping agriculture in a situation that has led to agrarian crisis, now we need to revert back the focus, the energy, and the resources to agriculture. Because if agriculture survives, then the economy survives. The world has now seen it. At a time when every industry was down and when shutters were down, it is agriculture which has kept the lifeline alive, not only in India, but globally. Even now, if the world doesn't understand the importance of agriculture, I think we are doomed for the years to come also, or for the next era that we're going to witness. And I think that is something which the educated, unfortunately, in these cities are the ones who are not understanding this. There's a terrible, terrible disconnect that I find between the urban educated population and, of course, the rural masses. That disconnect is what is leading to this kind of a thinking, which is actually programmed by the economics courses that you and me have studied. Economics 101 taught us, Economics 201 taught this, that, you have to pull people out of agriculture because agriculture is gone. It is no longer a future. And so that is what was taught to us. And so we have been programmed to believe that agriculture is unproductive. But let me tell you, agriculture alone is the sector which has answer to many of the problems that the world faces today, including climate change.
Very nice. I mean, that's a very good point. See, here I want to understand. I mean, you've been, I've been hearing from you. Like, I mean, yes, I mean, they have deliberately down for the agriculture farmers, which is understand. I mean, because of the, I mean, to control the inflation and all those things, they are restricting it. But when you come to the grocery store, when you go to the grocery store, even in India, I mean, it's not that cheap. I mean, if you go to Reliance Fresh or any other, I mean, big, I mean, metro or shop, and we go buy a kg of any tomatoes or onions, I mean, nothing is less than at least 40 or 50 rupees, whereas the farmer is only getting 10 rupees. So why, I mean, why can't, I mean, is there any system, I mean, which government can design where the farmer can sell it directly to the customer and, I mean, can benefit out of it, or benefit a little more higher prices? I mean, so what is it stopping and why is it happening? So customer is not happy by paying more price, and farmer is not happy by getting less revenue for himself.
Well, this is how the market economy works. Everywhere in the world, the market economy is dependent upon middlemen. You know, you don't like the middleman who comes in dhoti and kurta or the traditional Indian dress, but nobody has any problem with the middleman who comes with a tie and a suit. And this is what I think the world needs to understand. Why is it that the prices, the consumer prices are high? Why is it that the farmer doesn't get even a fraction of it? It's not only related to this particular middleman that we talk about. You know, when somebody has to sell tomatoes, somebody has to sell wheat, and so on. So the people who sit in the mandis, who wear the dhoti kurta or kurta pajama, we don't like them because Bollywood movies have given us an impression that these are evil forces and so on and so forth. They have been shortchanging farmers. But when it comes to the modern generation, you know, the educated people who become middlemen, they don't even think they are middlemen. They come and tell me that, you know, we will be able to squeeze the middleman out and we will provide farmers with a better price and the consumer with a better price also. The fact of the matter is that he or she also is a middleman. The same argument was floated when Walmart was to get into India, or Tesco and Sainsbury were to get in India. They said the middleman will be squeezed out, so farmer will get a better price and the consumer will get a better price. But nobody said that Walmart itself is a middleman. Middleman is somebody between the producer and the consumer. So Walmart is a big middleman. The big fish will eat away the small fish. But look at what had happened in America and Europe. Why is it that the share of farmers' income in every dollar worth of produce that you sell is hardly 4%? That's what is in UK. That's what is average in the US. And when you talk of the value addition that must take place, and that is where the farmers are missing out. They are not part of the value chains and so on and so forth. I listen to all these kind of things everywhere, and yet if you ask those people who are talking about value chains, what is the share of a farmer in the value chain that we are talking about? Nobody wants to tell you. Now look at a value chain. The Ecuador farmer sells his bananas in Europe. For every dollar worth of banana, the farmer gets 0.02. Look at India, the coffee chain. You know, we have so many Starbucks and baristas and Coffee Cafe Day or whatever you call them. And so now I thought maybe this value addition is not taking place in coffee also. But I recently went to inaugurate a coffee growers meet in Bangalore. And I was told by the coffee industry, coffee plantations people, that they are in a loss by 8,000 crores and they want government to write off 8,000 crores. I said, you must be doing very well. That's what I thought all these years. Coffee planters must be a little better than wheat and rice growers. But on the contrary, I'm finding they are into losses now. And then when I asked them, I said, hasn't the value chain helped you? Let's look into what does a farmer make in a cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks or when you go to Starbucks or barista. You know, and they gave me the figure next day. They worked out overnight. They said for a 250 rupees cup of coffee that you drink in these coffee kiosks, farmer gets just 1 rupee. Now is that value addition? I think we must look into the value addition the world is producing now. And I think unless 40 to 50% of the price that the ultimate consumer gets is passed on to farmers, I don't think it will bring about a sea change in the kind of economic situation that we see now. And that has to change. How will that change? Free market will not do that. Fair market will do that. That is why I am personally in favor of world trade, world fair trade in agriculture rather than world trade in agriculture, the free trade that we are seeing today. Because fair trade at least ensures that 40% profits goes to roughly 40% profit goes to the person or to the producer of raw material. That's the way we should help the people or the farmers. Now, that brings me to your question, again, that why is it that the consumer pays a higher price? Is because, as I said, this is how the markets operate. Everything that you do globally is dependent upon middlemen. Isn't the arms trade dependent on middlemen? Isn't the agriculture trade dependent on middlemen? Isn't the other industrial goods dependent on middlemen? I definitely agree that the middleman needs to squeeze out, but it doesn't mean that you bring in a modern, suited, booted middleman to replace the old middleman. That's not the answer. The answer also is not bringing Walmart to replace a battery of middlemen that existed earlier. That's also not the answer. The answer is to frame or structure the prices in a manner that the producer gets at least 40 to 50% or 60% of the ultimate price the consumer pays. That is the system that we should work. Can we evolve that system? I think it is not difficult. But the governments, neither the industry, they are not interested. And if they both join hands to do this, it is not very difficult. You can evolve system where farmers get a better price, consumers also get a better price. I think that's something which is doable and should be a win-win situation for everyone.
Very nice. I mean, I see that another point. I mean, why they succumb to the middle pressure from middlemen is. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, please. The small business people, I'm sorry, not small. The farmers, I mean, don't have enough money. I mean, or cash flow to survive for next 2 or 3 months or 4 months. So, I mean, that they are under tremendous pressure to sell the produce the moment they harvest them. So they have to liquidate it and then get the money and then move on. So that with that pressure, I mean, they have to sell it at the price the middleman demands. So there should be a system. Let us say they should. Another thing is the produce may get spoiled. Let us say vegetables, they cannot store them for more than 1 or 2 days, at maximum 3 or 4 days. So those are the other pressure points for them. So is there anything which government or any other agency or an NGO can step in and help them? Do you think those things will help? I mean, so that they can also negotiate. See, when you want to negotiate, when you're at the table of the negotiation, you should be always in a position to walk out, I mean, without a deal, then only you can negotiate better. But if you're in a desperate position, obviously, you'll always have to, I mean, go with the whatever the other guy says. So most of our farmers, I feel, I'm correct me again if I'm wrong, most of the time the farmers are in a desperate situation to make a deal. So that's where, I mean, other people will take an advantage of the situation and bargain at a low price. So those are the things. So how can we strengthen the farmer so that he can negotiate better the prices with the middleman?
So this is very often said, what you are trying to say, that, we should be able to organize farming communities in a manner that they can negotiate, they can argue, and they can see that they get a better price. But even in a country like America, the average land holding is about 444 acres, in America. The farm size is huge compared to small farmers in India, where the average farm size should be around 3 acres, But if you look at America, the point I'm trying to make is, I remember a tweet from a farmer in America and a corn grower. He said that unluckily, in the farm office that he has on the farm, he found a slip which is hanging there, pasted by his father in 1970. He said that the father had said that he had sold corn at the rate of 3.2 bushel, $1 per bushel, and he says now he was in 2018 or something. And he said, I am selling it at almost the same price, $3 per bushel, or $3.2, $3.4, whatever, around that figure. And imagine 1970 and 2018. If this is the situation in America, what bargaining power we are talking about? If American farmer doesn't have the bargaining power, you tell me, how can you imagine Indian farmers to have the bargaining power? The point I'm trying to make is that the design, as I said earlier, or the structure is something which will keep agriculture always in that position of loss, or in a position where they can't really have that balance being maintained, as you rightly mentioned. So we need to really evolve a system. That is what I'm trying to suggest again and again. We need to evolve a system where farmers should be assured a minimum of 40% of the price that a consumer pays. Can't we work out a system like that? Can't we work out prices in that manner? Why is it that when I quoted the OECD report to you, OECD report about India, when it said that 45 lakh crore rupees is what Indian farmers have lost in the 16, 17 years, the report also said very clearly that while the farmers, the loss was 15% prices depression or depreciation every year, the consumers gained by 25%. The consumer gained by 25%. And if that also is the reason, please tell me, in America, the dairy prices have now fallen down to such a level that small dairy farms are closing down in America at a faster pace, at a brisk pace. In about 17 years, 10,000 dairy farms have closed. In fact, many other studies are pointing to much a bigger number of dairy farm closures in America. So is the case in United Kingdom and also Europe. Now, why are the dairy farms closing down? Is because the buyers or the big retailers, the Tesco, Sainsbury, and Walmart, are squeezing the margin to stay competitive. They're cutting down on farmers' share. Now, this is something which is not acceptable, should not be acceptable, of course. But this is what the companies are doing. Is anybody questioning that? Please tell me, where is that question being raised? Why should the big retails be squeezing out the margins of the farmers to stay competitive? If that competition model is what is the world is looking at or is developing for the future, I think we need to evolve a different kind of a model where prices remain stable. That is why, sir, I have been arguing that what actually needs to bail out agriculture is to set up a farmers' income commission, where we are able to guarantee an assured incomes to farmer every month. Because farmer like you and me also cannot withstand the volatility of the markets. Farmers need to get an assured income. He also has a family to support. He cannot be expected to live in debt all through life. And in fact, an American farmer wrote in an article he commented. He said that it is like living in a hell if you live in debt all through your life. Farmer is born in a debt and dies in debt. We all know that. From that situation, we have to pull him out, and this can only happen if we provide an assured income to farmers. So in India, I have been struggling, I've been shouting, I've been making noise that that's the way I think that what we need is to bring farmers an assured income. And first to that, I said we must bring in direct income support to agriculture. For a number of years, Srinivas, I went on saying that. The economists scoffed at me, they laughed at me, saying, this person, he doesn't understand economics. In a free market economy, how can you go in for income transfer from the public to the private sector or to the farmers? I maintain that that's your thinking, I said, but there is no other way out. America and Europe farmers are surviving because they get direct income support. In Europe today, out of the $100 billion that is the subsidy support in 2018, 50% goes at direct income support. Now, in America also, direct income support has now been withdrawn, but earlier in the farm bills, it has over the decades been one of the instruments of helping the farmers. Now, I'm so glad that the NDA government, Mr. Modi's government in India, has 2 years back introduced what is called PM Kisan Nidhi and providing farmers with direct income support of 6,000 rupees a year. This may be very less. 500 rupees a month is a very, very small amount, but I called it a tectonic shift, because it has to move. Now the policies are moving from price policy to income policy. And as I said, income farmers need assured income. So this PM Kisan scheme, I'm sure would be able to fill that gap in the years to come. And I'm sure there will be more demand for allocating more resources under PM Kisan, but that is what farmers need. So therefore, the losses that farmers incur by way of the markets being competitive, I think should be compensated by state stepping in and meeting that gap that has been suffered by the farmers. I think that's the way forward. Not only in India, it's a way forward for European and American agriculture, American farmers also. And I think people in America, people in Europe must learn from India how we are fighting to bring and to demonstrate or to show that there is a way forward if the government sets up a national commission for providing farmers with an assured income.
Good. Thank you. It was nice explanation about how farmers should be compensated and why they should be compensated. That's very nice. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, earlier, the middlemen are squeezing a little bit corporate or the individual. And to be honest with you, there's one more. I recently read one more article about Walmart and another retail chain in the US, Kroger. They are introducing their own milk products right now. And so, so they're competing. They're kind of becoming another competitor for the actual farmers. So that's a different topic. So today, I don't know how much time you have with you. I mean, I wanted to ask you about the digital agriculture and organic farming. Do you think this will help the farmers, or if you want to push this topic another day, that's also fine with me. It's your convenience.
Well, I'm okay, but I think let's keep it for some other day. And sure. I don't want the audience also to feel tired after 1 hour.
I totally understand. I agree with you. Then that's what we'll push it another day. I want to have a last point. I mean, I know that you mentioned about the reverse migration of the people from urban to the rural areas nowadays because of this COVID-19. So what are your thoughts on the reverse migration? Do you think, agriculture will revive? People will go back to the agriculture, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my feedback is that those who have gone back, not more than 30% are going to return to the cities. And those who have gone back, they know that it is tough to continue with the kind of agriculture they left when they went to migrate or when they migrated to the cities. But they also know that this is one profession which can at least ensure that they don't sleep they don't sleep hungry, and they don't go to bed hungry every night. Even if it is less, they will still get something to fill their tummy. Now, given this condition, I think the focus of the country should be on revitalizing agriculture. And this is possible. And the government itself is now trying to pump in more money. It has tried to, upgrade the Manrega, the employment guarantee program. But I think more needs to be done on that front. Also, there needs to be more skill development in agriculture. There also needs to be more income, as I said earlier, to be enhanced in agriculture. If agriculture commodities income goes up, then I think it is very easy to revamp the kind of agriculture that India really looks forward to, or to reach that particular level. Will that be possible? I think when the Prime Minister says that we are looking towards an Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think Atmanirbhar Bharat begins with Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means Atmanirbhar agriculture. Because, as I said, 70% of the households in rural India are engaged with agriculture. So if agriculture, becomes profitable and economically viable, the rural economy also grows accordingly. And then, of course, once the rural economy grows, then the demand also grows. And once the demand grows, that's the engine for growth. So imagine the kind of demand that will grow in India if we were to provide more money into the hands of farmers. I don't want these people to come back into urban cities and meet the same fate again. Farmers or the migrant laborers, they are not a kind of a pendulum which keeps on swinging from one end to another. They are a respectable, part of the citizenry, and I think it is time that we revert back our focus to agriculture. And that is why I have been repeatedly emphasizing that here is an opportunity. It is a God-sent opportunity before us to not only revitalize agriculture, but to convert agriculture into the powerhouse of future economy, future economic growth. That potential agriculture carries. In fact, Srinivas, my statement, if you just see, for several years I have been saying agriculture is the only sector that can reboot the economy. And I stand by it. If India does not focus into agriculture now, which everyone now applauds and says that agriculture is the beacon of hope and so on and so forth, I think then we would be failing in duty for meeting the requirement of the future generation. And as I said earlier, not only for food, but maintaining in a sustainable way, as you rightly talked about organic agriculture, maintaining in a sustainable way the land resources, the water resources, and ultimately reducing the climate impact. Everything lies in agriculture. The answer lies in agriculture. So it is our responsibility, even if policymakers are not listening to, if you and me start talking about it, if you and me start raising their voice, means everyone who is listening, if we start raising our voice, believe me, the policymakers will have no option but to listen to you. So if the governments fail, don't blame anybody, blame yourself. Because you are not strong enough to raise your voice in a manner that the government would listen. So raise your voice wherever you are, in whatever form you can, and that will build up a kind of a strong message and the governments will be obliged to come and listen to what you are saying. Therein, I think, lies the future, and I am very hopeful that things will change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Devendra Sharma ji, for sharing your thoughts and insights and also your experience in this field. And hope, some policymakers will hear and they will act, and even the citizens will act towards this one and bring some changes in good way to the lives of the farmers. Thank you and have a nice rest of the evening, sir.